Apologies, I usually ask people to do that. Reminding myself to use the microphone. Yes, thank you very much for coming out. We've got a reduced number, unfortunately, but we'll be discussing that later. If we could start with the agenda for today, then apologies for absence.
No apologies.
Thank you. Declarations of interest. Thank you.
Sorry, just to say on that point that in order that we satisfy the requirement for a quorum of 50% independent members, that County Councillor Woodhouse is attending as an observer today rather than voting on any matters.
Thank you. The third item on the agenda to confirm the minutes of the previous meeting. If we can just turn to those, please. If we look at page 1, any issues there? Any? Yep. Page 2. Okay, and page 3 I think we can all agree on. Okay, so we can confirm the minutes as a true copy. Thank you. Move on to item 4 on the agenda, and I think Matt, do you want to take the lead on that one? So if I can hand across to you, please.
So agenda item 4 is the just to take a look at a review of the terms of reference of Monmouthshire County Council Standards Committee. So in the public pack we've got extract from Article 9 Part B of our Constitution. Now, this was due to be discussed at the last meeting, which, owing to my absence, we had to cancel. I suppose, as it was a pre-agreed agenda item for the previous one, the question is, when on refreshing yourselves with this, are there any thoughts that spring to mind, any points people would like to make in terms of the conduct of how they feel the Standards Committee is currently running? Certainly it's of interest to me as the fact that this is my first Standards Committee. I have some thoughts just on the short amount of time I've been here when I look over the terms of reference here, but I'd be interested in the committee's views on the terms of reference and how you feel the Standards Committee is running.
Well, first on the terms, the first 5 are imposed on us because they're statutory, and they'd be the same across, Powys or Carmarthenshire or anything. And on a quick review, I just looked at Powys's Standards Committee. It's very similar. So the optional extra ones, F and below, are very similar to Powys with a few minor changes and a bit more detail, perhaps. That was the only thing. And what I thought about this is, I didn't see anything obviously missing, but what would be interesting would be to map this onto a work programme so that we see, as we've got a cycle of 4 meetings a year, some of these things, for example, ensuring the council's complaints procedures operate effectively. There is an officer responsible for that who's got their own reporting responsibilities, and it would be good then to see how does our meeting schedule fit with what they have to do anyway, and the same would also apply to the review of whistleblowing. You could treat that in a similar way, and so that we could just do a check on this and map it across to a degree onto the next, let's say, the next 4 meetings looking forward. So actually, are we actually covering what we've got today? That was my first question. And then another thing that came up, I think, just after we started, so not this last year before, there was a new cabinet post created for governance, and one of the responsibilities listed was ethics and standards. And I just wondered how or whether there should or could be any integration between the work of the cabinet member, which I think is Councillor Jordan, who was previously on this committee, and the work of the committee, and how that might fit or not fit together, which is just an open question, really.
So just on the first point, I'm happy to take that as an action. We'll work on the full plan and ensure that the additional points, well, all points actually, both statutory and the additional ones, fit to the agendas as they come up. just a little bit more information on the governance cabinet member. What was your thinking? And attendance at the committee, a reporting function, or?
No, sorry, it was just, I think, as far as I was concerned, but I was new then, that new role just appeared, it must have been in 2017, I think, around the annual committee meeting. And I thought, that's interesting, a cabinet member for governance, and I looked at the responsibilities listed, and they include ethics and standards. And I thought, well, actually, we're the committee that does ethics and standards. And so I wondered whether or how the work and responsibilities of the cabinet member related to the work and responsibilities of the committee. So it was a question for you, really. And Councillor Jordan, previously, when I started here, he was a member of the committee, wasn't he? He was a council member of this committee, so he understands how it all works.
I imagine I am that link then, because he is my cabinet member and he is the person with whom I meet regularly. So I think I am that link, and including, as I think about how we conduct our meetings, which predominantly is focused more on the legal provision and as part of the governance elements of the council. I suppose what you rightly prompt me here to do is make sure that the activities of the Standards Committee are included within the pretty much monthly meetings that I hold with the cabinet member to ensure that there's that flow of information, not just in terms of what's being conducted here, but anything he then wishes to pass back. Would that be appropriate? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to say I think that you've raised a really important point there, and I think that needs to be clarified, because obviously something was overlooked when the portfolios holders' responsibilities were put together at the beginning, because it should be this committee that is responsible for that, not a cabinet member. Thank you.
It's just an observation. I'm happy with the way it is being organised, certainly. I just wonder sometimes if this committee needed a higher profile. And I think perhaps when we have the training, this might help.
That was one of the things that jumped out at me, and accepting that I am very much the new boy here, but looking through the terms of reference as they're set out, I wondered whether the committee felt it left them a little bit more reactive than proactive, and I suppose that's probably what your point goes to, but I'd be interested if others have comments on that point as well.
I can remember when we had one dispensation case to look at. Certainly it was not only beneficial for us because we learned a lot, you really felt that you had made a decision and played an important part. Whereas often was just reading information, coming along, and then you wait until the next meeting. But perhaps there's nothing to get us all excited about, but that's just my point, yeah.
Yeah, just on that, I've always considered that we're sort of reactive rather than proactive. But it's the areas where we can be proactive is quite difficult to identify. But has everyone had a chance to comment on this? Could I just sort of quickly go back on it? When I first joined the Standards Committee, one of the things that we did was just go through this in detail, just making sure that we understood it and we all had the same idea of what actual phrases meant. So if you look at, for instance, at promoting and maintaining high standards of conduct by councillors, co-opted members and church and parent governor representatives, how are we promoting and maintaining high standards? It's an open question.
Chair, should we be reviewing some of the meetings that are held in the council and seeing whether we can improve the standard of behaviour? Because I've certainly attended meetings where the behaviour of councillors has fallen below really what I feel should be expected. And I'm sure Councillor Woodhouse would back me up on this, because as Deputy Chairman, you see it from that end. And we have behaviours that take place in the chamber, and bearing in mind that all of our meetings are now live streamed, I think that it's very disappointing for the public to see some of this. I know that we see it every day in Parliament in Westminster, but I think that we should try as a committee perhaps to have some influence, and maybe we should have a look at some of these meetings and see whether we feel that what's going on there could be improved.
Yes, I'd agree with that. I think the thing that sort of confused everyone is the Carver ruling that politicians, councillors are supposed to have thick skins now to take this on. And I don't know the legal side of it, but it seems to give leeway for people to be rude is perhaps a better description, but they just seem free to say what they want on that basis.
I think the distinction I draw is with a case like Calver, and what it means is I think it creates a higher threshold for those in the public eye, politicians, to be brought up for some of the comments that, some of the criticism they received, the thicker skin test. While that might create a higher barrier or test as far as the Public Services Ombudsman is concerned in terms of what they will or won't investigate, I don't see that should then translate into lowering the standards of acceptable conduct within committee meetings or council or whatever the meeting might be. And really the how that particular meeting is run should still fall to the chair's discretion. So I hope, I mean, I don't know, but I hope that something like the Calver test isn't giving free rein to people to feel that they can act in a way that others would consider to be inappropriate. But it would be interesting to see if there was a link drawn between the two. And I wonder, just on in terms of the reviewing meetings within council, I suppose then what would it be a case that the committee would prepare a report back to a chair, to a meeting? I wonder how we would look to go about facilitating that.
Yeah, I was just looking through the agenda, but you mentioned the training session earlier, to see if there's anything that we could bring back from that, possibly focus on that when we go for our training. I do think it might be helpful to have independent members observing at our council meetings, and then obviously we can see councillors can be made aware of how the appearance, you can come back and give us a report, and the appearances to the outside person would be helpful if there are things that you could, identify that could be done, much better. It's just a case I think councillors sometimes might need to be reminded that they do know people are watching, but having somebody sitting in and then coming back with their views on the conduct at the meeting could be a way forward.
I just say on that, I did attend one council meeting. I was introduced by Rob, and everyone behaved absolutely impeccably after that. So just going through these then, it's just the way it's written. Like B is assisting the councillors, co-opted members and church and parent governors, representatives to observe the members' code of conduct. I can't say that I've ever assisted the councillors in any way. All that happens with the members' code of conduct is that we see it. If there are any proposed revisions to it, we get to comment on that. How it's then delivered to the councillors, etc., is really outside this committee's hands. I wonder whether we should be looking at whether that should be more proactive.
I think there's a thank you, Chair. I think there's a whole issue around, if a councillor feels, for example, they're being victimised or they're unhappy, they'd go to their leader of their group. But really, if councillors are under stress or, unhappy, it is a bit of a grey area, I feel. And is this something that perhaps this committee could be proactively offering advice to councillors? you know, in that sort of set of circumstances. I don't know. You know, there is a whole area around this. And I do wonder sometimes, you know, you say about being thick-skinned, but, you know, we're all human beings. And, you know, we do see perhaps, you know, some extreme cases, as there was with Carl Sargent and other councillors. But, you know, there must be, underneath that, there's other, you know, levels of stress that perhaps go unreported, and councillors are suffering in silence when people aren't observing the code of conduct and treating them in a way which they should be respected.
Yeah, again, another good point. I think, Matt, I think you're their first point of call, aren't you?
Yes, certainly. You're quite right with the group leaders is a very good point of contact, and I try and I certainly try and maintain contact with those group leaders as well. But individually, then all councillors should absolutely feel they always have the ability to come and speak to me about any of these matters. And this cuts both ways. It's both those who feel that there is conduct elsewhere that needs commenting on, or indeed you know, potentially the subject of complaints too. I speak, and I have, you know, in the short time I've here, spoken to councillors on both sides of that partition, and absolutely the role of the monitoring officers to be there. You then step a little bit further into the areas of potential stress and well-being, which is, you mentioned the likes of Carl Sargent, and admittedly it's not an area I'd given much more consideration to, but it's an incredibly important point. And it'd be interesting to think further on where that conversation should be further articulated, whether the Standards Committee can go far enough in stepping into those sorts of areas, although I'm sure any involvement in the assisting and the oversight and the feedback that we've discussed already would play a big part in that. But whether there's a broader conversation to be had there on that matter, I don't know. I'm not really offering an answer there, but it was an interesting point to raise, certainly.
Can I just say, I did watch one of the council meetings once, one of our meetings, and I was surprised at the attitude with some of them. And I do think there is an element of concern there, and it would be an ideal opportunity for us to be proactive after we've had our training, and for them to be aware that we are being more proactive. And there was something under the Carl Sargent thing. It was a policy of dignity and respect policy. I mean, do we have a dignity and respect policy? And again, the other thing that we might consider, or they might consider, is just meeting with the chairs of various committees so that we can work together and perhaps improve everything for everybody.
That's a very good suggestion. I don't know, Matt, have you got a response on that?
Yes, there is a workplace dignity policy which is going, I think, has just completed a rewrite, but that sits within the hands of the HR. But I will certainly, I went through it as a draft, looking at it very much from a workplace lawyer point of view, but actually it would be interesting to revisit that and see how it applies on the political side of things as well. I think the meeting with chairs of the committees is, if we're moving into this area of attendance and observation and feedback, I think that's probably the most effective way of completing that feedback loop, and I've certainly made a note of that. And it'd be again, putting that, I have actually put a similar question to the person who'll be conducting the training in January to understand what it is we can do to be a little bit more proactive. So these would be good topics of conversation at that training.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was quite interesting to see recently somebody raised an issue in Democratic Services Committee meeting, and the chair dealt with it very well. And following on from that, it was the councillors' concerns over an issue. We all received, all the councillors were offered training on this particular area. So there is obviously a definite link with Democratic Services here.
Yeah, the other thing that concerns me as a chair of a committee is that obviously being a chair, requires a lot of skill and training and knowing how to manage the meeting and to deal with individuals. And when I was a councillor previously on another authority, I received training on being a chair. Now, this didn't happen here. And I think that this is very important that, if somebody is given the responsibility of being a chairman, they need to have that training that will help them carry out that task. I mean, in a previous life, I went on a whole week's course in London on chairing and attending meetings when I was in my 20s. And I have to say, that was probably one of the best courses I've ever attended in my life, and it's stuck with me until now. But, it doesn't need to be a week's course, but you do need to have training because it can help you. And I think to be able to deal with certain individuals, I mean, we have situations in our chamber here where we have some members who will, we have these machines where you speak to divert attention from other people who are speaking. They'll deliberately press that so that the camera comes over onto them, and other people can't be then seen on the live streaming. There's all sort of tricks that are going on that is disrespectful to the people that are speaking in the chamber, and it really is down to the chair to control that situation. But we do need to look at training as a council as a whole for councillors, I think.
Yeah, thank you for that. I didn't realise that sort of thing went on. I'm also surprised that you didn't get training because looking at, again, our role as Standards Committee, if you look at E, for instance, it says advise training and arrange to train councillors, cooperative members, etc. I think if it had been raised before, perhaps about chairs not getting training, then we could have sort of put something forward.
We, as councillors, when we go on these different committees, we do get training. But it's right, what's been said, that chairs don't get the training. But it is a bit awkward that for chairs to have training, they'd have to have it after they've been elected. And I think when we're coming up to, like, the AGM, if somebody's going to be nominated as the chair, they should be putting that training beforehand.
Did you want to come back on that?
None of us are perfect, and we need to be improving all the time. And we need to have follow-up training as chairs of committees because it can only help us to have a more efficient meeting, if we receive that training on an ongoing basis.
No, again, I think it's a very good thing to raise that. Richard, you've been quiet. Normally you have comments on this one, so...
Yes, I'd just like to ask Jane about the behaviour then in meetings. It just doesn't reach the threshold at which someone would put in a code of conduct complaint, because then that's in the system. And is it that people actually go, I'm not happy with that, I don't like it, but either I'm not going to, or I can't be bothered, or I don't think there's any point in actually doing a formal conduct complaint? Because I'm thinking, is there some gap then between something that's really completely unacceptable that would be complained about formally, and we'll be talking, we go a formal complaint into MAT, and it'll be processed, perhaps go to the Ombudsman, all of that stuff. And there's nothing underneath that then. Is that the nature of the problem?
Chair, are you happy for me to come back? I think it's irritating, persistent offenders. It's the same people that are doing this. They continue to speak in the meeting when other people are speaking. And, it's difficult really to actually pin it down. It's not behaviour that would warrant going to the Ombudsman, but it is very irritating behaviour. And it's disrespectful to other people in the chamber. So, everybody's aware of it, and we all know who the people are that do it. But it does mean that we're not getting such a good meeting because what's being, and in the future, many more people are going to look at things online than they are at the moment. And I think we have to have ways of working. I mean, we know if Sheila was speaking in a meeting and she had an important point to make, the two councillors either side of her, perhaps on the same party, would have to keep a close eye on certain individuals who would press the button and press the button again so that the camera comes back to them, so that they can't divert attention away from that person to make a, you know, who's trying to make perhaps a political point.
I think as it stands, we should be able to do something to address that.
Yeah, well, I like the idea coming back to both the meeting with the chairs of the committees, but also the training element of the chairs, which I hadn't appreciated. So thank you. I think in terms of the timing of meeting of chairs, I don't think we need to wait for people to be nominated as chairs. I think you can conduct training to as many people as possible in the view that they will either be chairs themselves or they're going to be people who are going to be controlled by chairs in meetings. So I think the training cuts both ways. And yes, I'm now going to be keeping an eye out for this certainly on Thursday, because it's not something I'd picked up on. So thank you.
Can I just ask what's happening Thursday, Matt, out of interest?
Sorry, I should be fair. We've got a full council meeting Thursday afternoon, so that's typically the longer of the meetings, and certainly the one where you have the greatest presence. So as the one that I have to attend, it means I can keep a bit more of an eye out for it.
So you'll be present at that meeting as the monitoring officer and the head of legal services as well. Are you wearing both hats at the same time when you do that?
Yes. Yeah, I have to attend as the monitoring officer, but if there's anything of a legal nature that comes up as well, then clearly I'm there to assist as best I can.
I'm quite surprised to hear what Jane's been saying there. I come from a more commercial background, and if there was a meeting taking place, there'd be somebody in charge of the meeting who would bring things to audience, which I'm assuming happens in this scenario because you'll have a chairperson in these council meetings, and some of the issues that have been talked about as well around respect and so on. Ultimately, you would have an HR department, and I don't know how that happens in the council, how that kind of plays into some of the public meetings that take place within the council. But there's those kind of checks and balances sort of before we think about sort of getting involved, which I do think is actually quite a good idea, by the way. But there's those sort of on the day in the room. I would have thought there were sort of enough checks and balances around to try and rein in some of those bad behaviours, but I don't probably understand enough about public life.
So,
As Jane mentioned earlier, I'm vice chair, so I can see this happening, and it is a difficult area. I mean, at the end of the day, you sort of want people to feel comfortable enough to speak and to be listened to. It does get frustrating, but I think now it's been raised here that this does happen. It's not a hugely, how can I say, recurring problem. There are a few people that do it. I'm right, Jane, and there's a few, and we know who they are. So I think possibly now it's been raised here, a sort of, how can I say, a communication to all members about this discussion today, and how our independent members were very shocked and surprised that this is happening, because that's what we're hearing. And that could act as a good sort of gentle reminder to these people that we are aware they're doing it. It's been discussed at standards, and please could you refrain from doing so? It will be monitored more closely in future. That's sort of a communication, an email or whatever, or a bulletin, just to make people aware that it is noticed.
Yeah, I think from what you've said now, so you know what the inappropriate behaviours are, and you know perhaps there are persistent offenders, then I'd suggest something in writing. But what I've seen work very well in the past is at the start of the meeting, the monitoring officer stands up and gives quite a firm steer on behaviour that has been discussed at this committee, how it is inappropriate and how it does link, and how if you continue to do this, you are at risk of a code of conduct complaint, and also at bringing the authority into disrepute, and lay it on heavy at the start of a meeting and see what happens. And I've been on committees and authorities where that's been done for other, various reasons, and I think that does get member attention in a way that a written or an email among several hundred doesn't. Because it sounds like it's a specific number of repeat people and it's a specific behaviours. So you could do something very targeted to the behaviours and why they are wrong and inappropriate. That would be my suggestion.
I think you'd need to witness it for yourself first before you were felt comfortable to do that, I imagine.
Chair,
Yeah,
I think also, before he could do that, or would happen to do it, you'd have to get permission of the chair.
I think what I was going to say is, because we'll have a pre-council just get together, then I'll raise it in that forum. Whether I would need to understand a bit better whether I'm at the point where I would want to take that action straight away for the point that Richard mentioned, because I've not actually witnessed it myself yet. But those meetings with the chair, vice chair, the chief exec and the monitoring officer, there's sufficient heft up there that if we pick up on something that we can get the point across principally through the chair there, I would suggest.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, obviously, you only have to look at past full council meetings and see the behaviour. It'll be very obvious to you. You don't need to get permission to look at those council meetings. Anybody can view them. And it'll be very obvious to you where this behaviour is taking place. And I think if councillors are aware that the Standards Committee are looking at committee meetings and witnessing this behaviour and taking a close interest in it, then, you know, that in itself will hopefully help change behaviours and, you know, give us a better meeting and a more effective meeting. Pardon? Yeah, and the other thing, if I can just say quickly, the other thing is when you become a chair, you know, you start off and you chair a few meetings and there's nobody really saying to you how well you're doing. You don't know whether you're doing well or badly. And often, you know, you look to the democratic service, democratic officers that are with you to say whether or not the meeting went well or if it didn't go well. And as a chairman myself, I would really welcome criticism, you know, constructive criticism from this committee to say, you know, well, Jane, you know, perhaps, and maybe this is something that hasn't really happened in public service, like the gentleman, you know, I also have a commercial background originally in business, and in business this happens all the time. Your work is evaluated and you're told quite clearly how you're doing. This doesn't always happen in council, and I think if you know we did have these training sessions, then you know perhaps we could review some of our own meetings and look at them and think, well, what could we have done better in that meeting? Because at the end of the day, if it's going to mean this council is more effective, then that can only be a good thing.
Absolutely, I agree. I just want to raise one final point on this particular subject, but just as far as we're moving along, we haven't made any proposals, haven't formalised the things that's been said today. Do we need to do that, Matt, to make sure that action will go forward from here?
Well, it's been a fairly wide-ranging discussion. I've certainly made a very good note of everything that's been discussed, and I'm sure it'll be captured in the minutes as well. So it really falls to you as to whether there's something specific you wanted to have proposed and voted on. But I'm certainly happy to take away a number of actions. I've got quite a long list of things here that I've written down.
Chair, could we just ensure that we have a report back then at the next meeting?
Yeah, sorry. There's just something finally back to what you raised originally. The terms of reference of the committee. You know, in D, monitoring from time to time, reviewing the operation of the members' code of conduct. Yeah, and then there's the protocols which apply to members of the council, etc. Has been added to the clause that comes from the Local Government Act. And there is something in Monmouthshire called the Protocol for Self-Regulation of Member Conduct somewhere, which I believe came into existence when the Ombudsman was keen that member-on-member complaints were first port of call, were dealt with internally here. And I wonder whether that, in the light of this discussion, should also be reviewed, because it sounds like the protocol for the self-regulation of member conduct will involve group leaders having responsibility, and responsibility for dealing with, it's not to trivialise it, but let's call it low-level behaviour which might not meet the threshold of a complaint, a formal conduct complaint, but still is damaging both to the reputation and its effect on individuals. And so that would fit with a review of this. might be worth looking at that and seeing what does that say about, in particular, I'm thinking group leader responsibilities in particular. You know.
Yeah, sorry, my final thing I want to say on this, about the whistleblowing policy, we know there's a policy. As far as I'm aware, the Standards Committee has never really been actively involved in monitoring how effective the policy is. I just wondered whether that is there something within the council that monitors that?
So the policy sits as a preserve of people's services, and I'm not aware of it, again, in my short experience, being called into use at all, but I can ask the question and report back.
Fortunately, my computer has now decided to give up the ghost, but hopefully we'll come back on in a minute. So, I just want to see where we are on the agenda.
Public service ombudsman.
Okay. Right, so thank you very much, everyone, for that discussion on our constitution. If we can move on to the next item on the agenda, then the Public Service Ombudsman for Wales report.
Again, this is an agenda item that was carried over from the previous meeting. So actually, we're looking at a report which is relatively old now, and it does have some crossover with the next agenda item, which was the Standards Conference, which was held in September. I suppose the thing I'll just say at the outset, because I receive various legal updates and bulletins and what have you. So just to add, because it's referenced within the report, the Public Services Ombudsman Wales Bill is at the second stage of going through the Wales Assembly at the moment. And that includes provisions to provide new powers for the Ombudsman to deal with complaints made orally as opposed to the written process that happens at the moment. There is some elements that relate to the investigation of private medical treatment, because the health elements, as you can see from the statistics within the report, are the bigger workload for the Ombudsman compared to code of conduct matters. But they also are looking to get the ability for the Ombudsman to conduct investigations of their own undertaking, so no complaint required. Quite what would trigger that, I don't know. But also these own initiative investigations could also be carried out in conduct with regard to how complaints are handled, what standards and procedures within different organisations are. So it's certainly a broadening of the powers that the Public Service Ombudsman has. And just to tie in with that, just from my recent experience of speaking with certain members of the Public Service Ombudsman's team, whereas I think, as I understand the process previously, a complaint would be received in on any matter, be it health, code of conduct, or any of the matters that they deal with, and then allocated, I think, almost on a cab rank basis to an investigator, that they're now looking to group their investigators into teams. So I think, so from our point of view, there would be a council-focused code of conduct kind of team. So they would build up a better picture of what's going on, trends, which would probably lead in the future to these own initiative investigations. But it'd be interesting to see if that makes a difference to whether more complaints are accepted, fewer are accepted, or how it might work out.
Okay, thank you for that. Comments, please, on the Public Service Ombudsman's report. Richard.
Well, just looking at the top level at the data, I think from the county council point of view, it's another year of good data, and we should commend all members of the county council for keeping up, that high standard of behaviour, because obviously there was one referral to the adjudication panel, which I think is Councillor Down there, but actually that's the only referral from Monmouthshire I went back in the last 4 years. So over the last 4 years, there have been no referrals to Standards Committee, which is why we've had no hearings, and there's only been one to the panel, which was Councillor Down, over the last 4 years, which I think is a good set of data, overall for the council. of course, taking account of the point we've raised earlier about behaviour that is below the threshold, which is something we're going to get onto. And the interesting thing about the community councils was I did see the Ombudsman is a bit concerned because the number of complaints had gone up a bit, in my view, not in total across the whole of Wales, but there's 735, according to One Voice Wales, town and community councils in Wales. And I went down the list, and what that means is 681 of them didn't have a single conduct complaint last year, and that will be true of most of the 33 town and community councils here in Monmouthshire. I think most of them have 0 complaints. And on all the complaints against all town and community councillors across the whole of Wales, so you're talking about 144, there wasn't a single referral to a standards committee or a single referral to the adjudication panel. So they were dealt with, but actually there was nothing that was seen to be a breach that broached the threshold. So again, a good result for all town and community councils, I think, and therefore for town and community councils within the county.
Yeah. Any other comments on Jane?
I think obviously I totally agree with the comments that have already been made, but the one thing that really stood out for me was the number of complaints concerning the National Health Service, which was extremely worrying. And I think that I understand that having sort of sat on a council and been responsible for health, which is obviously devolved here, but we don't deal with it at a council in the same way as we do in England, that the process in England is I understand, different for people complaining concerning the health service. I'm sure Sheila Woodhouse, you would have a lot more experience than me about this, but I think it's extremely worrying, the level of complaints concerning the National Health Service.
Yeah, I'd agree. Sorry, suffering from cold. Yeah, I think that's outside our brief, isn't it? Anything to do with the National Health Service. Yeah.
So the next item was the feedback from the standards conference that both I and Richard M attended back in September. I put a feedback note together at the time, which was distributed. I won't run through that email again. A couple of things just to draw out from it. In fact, firstly, just in response to Councillor Pratt's comment on the health board side of things, again, not within our remit, but it's a comment true of the health board as much as it is on the code of conduct complaints. When the Ombudsman was briefing us, the point was made that actually the vast majority of complaints that they deal with are complaints about a failure to respond to a complaint or how a complaint is handled or the process that's gone through, as opposed to the kind of 10% maybe of complaints which are about an actual base issue in and of itself. And like I said, that's true of both health board and code of conduct. So that there's a point to note there in terms of the importance of our complaints handling procedures and the work that committees like the standards committees do. The only thing I wanted to draw out, and I'm interested in your views on this, although I'm conscious that it's been a while since there was a hearing conducted. When we sat down and we went through, in the afternoon of the conference, we went through case studies to role play through in terms of how it would be dealt with by a standards committee. The thing that struck me as a lawyer and as someone who comes from a different background was how very quickly the monitoring officer went from a position of providing impartial advice to becoming a witness, essentially, because as the first point of contact to advise on whether something should fall to an ombudsman or not, I've done it a number of times since I've been here, looked to provide impartial advice to someone, what the tests are, potentially even the chances of them meeting those tests, to give them an idea as to whether it's worth. And then I've been subject to the fact since then that an ombudsman, in looking to make an assessment as to whether to carry out an investigation, has then asked for my advice as part of that investigation. And of course that changes the monitoring officer or legal advisor, depending on the kind of hat that you're wearing, and there's blurred boundaries. from being that impartial advisor to effectively a witness, because your advice is now presented as a statement within an investigation. And in the 3 cases that were discussed with us from Powys, who were leading on this conversation, they'd done 3 cases in the last year. In each one of those, the monitoring officer appeared at the Standards Committee as a witness instead of actually as a person who's there to provide impartial advice, so someone else from a legal department or a monitoring officer from a neighbouring county. So I'm just interested if I know there's potentially limited experience, but whether that's the experience here and the views on, I suppose, the requirement on me to involve more people, probably from the legal team, when it comes to deputy monitoring officer roles, because I don't think there is one in place at the moment. So that a bit of feedback and a question as well.
Richard, you want to reply on...
Just on the specific point, you're right, as soon as you lose your independence, and that could be just someone ringing you early in the early stages, I'm not happy about this, shouldn't I put it to the Ombudsman, and then you said something to them or put something in an email and everything, then it's into the system. When it comes back then, you're sort of disqualified in terms of being seen as independent and therefore able to advise the members of the hearing.
See, my view is it's possible for the legal advisor or the monitoring officer to remain in impartiality as long as you are advising in accordance with the guidance and the context of the situation. And my previous experience, any involvement in investigations within the Royal Navy or the wider military context in which I used to work, the lawyer actually very much stayed at the centre of any ongoing situation and was entirely capable of and trusted to provide impartial advice to all parties. But how you would preserve that impartiality was through the ongoing privilege of the advice that was given. So there was always a firewall between the different parties. Here, or with the Ombudsman, having had my advice requested, would then make me, regardless of how I felt I could act impartially, would make me a witness. So I think it would remove any control I or the Standards Committee have over that. Now, when that's happened, I've actually asked the individual to whom I gave the advice, it's their decision, because of the privilege, the advice is to them as to whether they disclose it or not. But I've asked that they consider that they don't disclose it so that I can maintain an impartiality. But it's that, again, the control does not sit with me. So there wasn't really a consistency that I could see in terms of how monitoring officers control this. And I suppose I'm interested in if my background is more of a case of keep the advice distinct from the investigation, because I'm only advising on something that's been told to me. I'm not a witness to the events going on. Whether the Standards Committee, I suppose, feel that advice should go in, if they've seen previous cases before, whether seeing the legal advice provided throughout is part of a hearing, or whether it's not something they would need and they would prefer me to ask people not to provide that advice.
I think you're right. You're not a witness, and therefore you could argue that actually you've preserved your independence, and therefore you can still advise at the hearing because you're not the decision maker. So in Herefordshire, the complaint comes in. The decision maker is the monitoring officer, having consulted the independent person or persons. So therefore, if or when they request an appeal and they get the right to appeal, at the appeal it has to be the deputy monitoring officer who advises the panel. But that's completely different because they are the decision-making power, which you are not the decision-maker, and you're not a witness in creating new evidence. You're simply commenting on the papers, if you like, or what people have told you.
It sounds like send your deputy to do everything, I think. Richard, you were at the same meeting. Do you have any comments?
On this specific point or the conference in general? I mean, just first of all, on this particular point, I think the question that's in my mind as you're saying that, Matt, is around what kind of advice are people asking you to give in these situations? Can you just put a bit sort of practical context around that?
Generally, it would be a conversation or an email exchange outlining a situation with which someone feels uncomfortable. Could be a member of the public. In fact, almost exclusively, it's either been a member of the public or a member of a town or community council. And it will relate to conduct by a county councillor or a town or community councillor, and whether or not it is something that could be considered to breach the code of conduct, and whether there is any, whether there's something that can be done initially to resolve that, or whether it's something that should be pushed on to the Public Service Ombudsman. A lot of the time, the blurred lines between monitoring officer and legal advisor are clear, because a lot of the questions actually pertain to the general running of a town and community council, the use of standing orders, asking for interpretation of those, and that's where I have to be careful, because I'm not a legal advisor to town. They have to remain at a degree of sovereignty, and a lot of the time these are issues that can be resolved through their exercising their democratic mandate. That, you know, the majority will make the decision. But if it's something that's likely to end up in a matter that would appear in front of the Standards Committee, it would be, does this feel right? Should I go to the Ombudsman? That kind of advice.
So dealing with the complainant in that situation, who might be a member of the public rather than a member of a council. Yeah, okay. So it's quite a tricky situation, isn't it? And then the structure within your team, do you have a deputy within your team?
So I have a deputy, although I am going through, and the thing that's fixating me quite considerable at the moment is I'm going through a considerable process of change with regards to the makeup of that team and the structure. So I'm not in a position at the moment to properly identify a long-term deputy, but I expect to be in the position to do so as we move into, well, I've got a period of recruitment to go through, but come the summer, I expect things to be settled, and I can identify possibly not one, but even possibly two deputies, if I can see the advantage of doing that.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just say that as a community councillor as well, I've, over the last year, my community council has used One Voice Wales quite a considerable number of occasions. And could it be perhaps that a lot of community councils need re-educating, and that it's all too easy for them to pick up the phone to you, when in fact they should be picking up the phone to One Voice Wales?
It's certainly something I try to do each time I have these conversations, because not all town and community councils are affiliate or use the services of One Voice Wales, which makes it an inconsistent picture. And even those that do are sometimes a little unsure as to the quality of the advice that they're given, because they know they come here, they get a lawyer, and I'm not sure quite whether that's the same. But you're right, I do try and make the point of where the more appropriate, and the Clerks Council is another good source of information as well. It's an ongoing interesting question for me, because again, these blurred lines between legal advisor and monitoring officer, of course, I think most monitoring officers will act the same or have the same view as me, and that even if we're not there to provide legal advice, and we certainly can't conflict ourselves with the advice that we provide to council, because that is our client, there are certain things you can do which I suppose in the name of good governance it's sensible to try and assist them with, but it's just knowing how far to take that before it becomes an issue of conflict, or they should be going elsewhere.
That's an interesting point, but I do feel that if someone comes for advice, that advice would determine any future action. So it seems to me that it should be made clear that it's a departmental advice rather than a personal advice. I think if you gave advice as a department, and then they couldn't really call you as a witness, but then you would be free to give your opinion later on.
There are legal matters on which we try and help where it is certainly departmental advice. So when you get into the realms of planning, for law, for example, again, only up to a point, because there's the potential for conflict later on. The problem is most people will come to me as the monitoring officer rather than as the lawyer. So it's hard to then make that distinction, because if it's code of conduct, then it has to, as the named person by statute, it has to come to me. So it's a dilemma.
It is a dilemma, isn't it? Because you're always got to think who's your client in that situation. And I think if a member of the public contacted me in my line of business and said, I've had a bad experience or I want to make a complaint, I would get the information from them and say, thank you, leave it with me. I will look into it, but I will look into it from this side of the fence at what's been going on to give you a bad experience, make sure somebody's not doing something that they shouldn't be doing towards the customers or the members of the public. And that's where maybe there's the monitoring officer and the legal services, actually there's this sort of impossible conflict there, because of course if a member of the public contacts you to say they've had a bad experience in a council meeting or with a councillor, you're not in the head of legal at that point, that's your monitoring officer hat, and that does present almost an impossible conflict, doesn't it? Is there an obvious way through it? Is there when you've got a deputy in place, or is there a different layer of sort of people within the council that would naturally pick this sort of stuff up?
So firstly, it makes you appreciate the importance of a complaints process, and I know Annette Evans briefed at the last standards committee that you had, and so she plays a crucial role in ensuring that there is a central filter through which a lot of these things come. But if it is of a clear code of conduct matter, then it does come straight to me. It's not for her to deal with. And that's unavoidable, and I have the duty then to advise that person. So the obvious resolution for issues further on is to have a deputy or to seek assistance from neighbouring monitoring officers and other local authorities. So you would probably find in a hearing that you had to sit on, it would not be me providing the advice at that point. It's something to be aware of.
Yeah, Richard, sorry, I'm cutting you off there.
Not at all. Just on the conference more generally, it was a fantastic day. Actually, I really thoroughly enjoyed it. It was fascinating to hear Nick Bennett, the Ombudsman, speaking. He spoke really well, and actually, when I flicked through the report, obviously it's come to us a little bit late, but all of the sort of threads, he communicated those beautifully in his kind of half an hour that he had to speak. So he's a very engaging chap. So if anybody hasn't ever heard him speak and gets a chance to hear him, I would encourage that. And then interesting to hear Claire Sharp, who's the president of the adjudication panel as well. And I think we then moved on with Matt and I both chosen to go to the same workshops in the afternoon. So we went to a workshop around social media and the ways in which social media gets used in public life, and then there was the standards hearing kind of practical issues workshop that we went to in the afternoon, which was run by the guys at Powers who'd had lots of practical experience, which makes me kind of enthusiastic to go to the training that Matt's lined up for us in January, because going into those kind of situations where you get to share war stories with people around the table, they were telling you their experience. The one thing I found is it challenged a lot of my perception, a lot of my instinct, because they would say, what do you think we should do in this situation? You'd go, well, this feels right and that feels right. And they would go, well, actually, we explored that and it wasn't the right way to do it, or that wasn't reasonable enough. And it was really, really useful way to spend some time, and a really good way to kind of bring some of the subject matter of what we do to life a bit more. And I think it's quite difficult to get some traction when we're coming together once a quarter in the way that we do. So to see that in practice and to go to the training in January, I think is a great opportunity. I also think, for what it's worth, just going back to a point earlier on in the agenda, once we've done the training in January, I think that's the idea of actually doing a bit more monitoring and observing off the back of that. I think that would be a useful way for us to be a bit more proactive, to see a bit more about life within the council and how it's playing out.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with you. That was the impression I got from the Standards Conference that I attended in, I think it's Llandudno, where just listening to other people who sit on other standards committees was quite enlightening to find out how they actually address some of the problems that we sometimes come across. Just one point from me about the Standards Conference was, first of all, thank you, Matt, for such comprehensive notes on it, really. It's as if we were there, actually. There's a note about Claire Sharp saying that the new sanctions guidance came into force on the 1st of September 18 and will remain live dynamic document that will respond to feedback from standards committees. I just wonder, presumably that is now live, and what sort of feedback are they looking for?
So you find me going to the link of what the actual sanctions guidance were, because remember they were actually quite hard to find, and I've gone via Caerphilly's website. So the foreword of the sanctions themselves, written by Claire Sharp, talks about being developed by members of the Adjudication Panel for Wales in consultation with the Public Service Ombudsman, monitoring officers and other interested parties. So clearly if there was an initial consultation probably pushed out via email to monitoring officers, I wouldn't be aware of that having happened before my time. And then it's seeking, I assume therefore ongoing consultation will happen via the monitoring officers or it makes reference to other interested parties, but there's no explanation. I can't recall, Richard, I'm not sure if you can, quite how the mode of feedback was due to happen. I imagine it through monitoring officers would be the most appropriate route. It's not one that's been discussed at the monitoring officers conference that I attend either quarterly. So I don't know what the specific mechanism was, I'm afraid. In the absence of being able to articulate what that mechanism should be, though, I'm sure that the feedback passed through me, and certainly something I could bring for conversation at the conference if it was ever required. But it's not a matter that's come up yet.
So, Trevor, perhaps we could have that on our next agenda, the sanctions guidance. Yeah.
Recommending standards conferences to every member of a standards committee. So if you didn't get to go this year and this one comes up next year, then I strongly suggest that you try to get to it. So if we can move on to the next item on the agenda, please.
So this is the report I submitted as part of the agenda pack on the recruitment process for 2 new independent members. I am indebted to Richard Stowe as well for all the information he's passed to me. Apologies that it's taken this long to push this out as well. I'm conscious this has been an issue for a while. Suffered slightly for a change in monitoring officer and where my direction of focus has largely been. But the long and short of it is standards committees, as defined by the regulations, are to be constituted of between 5 and 9 members. We currently number 7, but in order to achieve quorum, at least 50% of any meeting needs to be constituted by independent members. So having lost a couple of members before my time, we now need to go through the process of recruiting 2 more. The process for doing that, again, the statutory requirement is that it is advertised in not less than 2 newspapers. So the proposal I have is the following, well, set out in the recommendations of the report at 2.1. But the communications department here have drafted a press release with a comment from Paul Jordan, actually, as the cabinet member for governance. And that'll be, with your approval, that'll be pushed out immediately on completion. That's ready to go using the Monmouthshire County Council's network, social media, methods of interaction, press release given to all relevant newspapers and media outlets. Then, even though that will probably hit quite a good degree of coverage, there is still the requirement to advertise in the two papers, and there's even if our press release gets picked up, because we don't control the nature of how much of that will be used, there is still the requirement to go to the papers. So the plan will be to put those adverts out in early January. It's been quite convenient it working out this way, because we've actually just gone through a recruitment process for school admissions and exclusions panels. So making a distinction between the two has proved quite useful, and that recruitment process is just coming to an end now. I omitted this in the resource element at the bottom, but the adverts would go out at a cost of probably in the region of £400 or £500 for approximately half-page advertisements. They'd need to go out in both English and Welsh, as is required by the language standards in Wales. And I think the likely outlets would be the Argus and the Free Press in terms of just coverage across the authority. So my proposed timeline then is the deadline for applications following that push will be on the 8th of February, a panel sift to take place the week commencing the 11th, with recommendations to the council on the 7th of March, and then conveniently our standards committee takes place after the council on the 7th of March on the 18th. And so the question I had on that timeline, is that acceptable? I think previously an interview process was carried out, although the statute doesn't actually require it. So there's a question as to whether that would like to be, you'd like that to happen. If so, I've suggested week commencing the 25th of February. If you're happy to conduct it as the panel sift, and that panel needs to comprise no more than 5 members, then we can play around with the other dates on there in terms of application deadlines. But pending any questions, those are what I'm seeking approval for, effectively.
Richard?
I think for me, I feel it's essential to do interviews, because I think some of the skills, effectively, original advert that you're looking for, whether it's oral communication skills, listening skills, influencing, the ability to constructively challenge in terms of standards issues and put up an argument, etc., all of those things. And I think you'd run too big a risk of getting it wrong by not interviewing, because if you've done this in other areas, often you look at forms, you may even look at references, and then after following an interview, which has to be structured against the criteria, etc., you do change your opinion, and you may get some surprises. And I think, given the importance of the skills you would want to see here, in terms of fitting in and the culture and all of those sort of things, I think an interview's essential. I thought the interviews that we were put through were very thorough and tough, and I thought very professionally done here. And I think, that would, in my opinion, it's definitely interviews along the same way that Richard and I were interviewed.
I agree with it.
I'd just like to say I fully support you in this, and I think we need to move forward with this as quickly as possible, because it's not a good situation that we have at the moment, that we haven't got these 2 members that we need.
So, as I understand it, that's full support for the interviews. Are we happy with the dates that are proposed then in the report?
I've got a spare day on 25th of December.
Just to add as well, it will be an online application this time, so the website's being sorted out today, so that when it does go pushed out on our social media, it will be a link to an online application, and we'll get rid of the handwritten process that happened before.
Any views on who the panel of interviewers will be?
So let me just turn to the report, because I know it stipulates the layout. There must be a lay panel member, so an independent member. There must be a town or community councillor, and it must constitute no more than 5 people. I think it's entirely right for the committee to decide. It might be something you want to discuss now. It might be something you want to leave until closer to the time in terms of just diary availability. And I suppose a question I would pose as well is, would you wish to split between the panel and then those who are involved in the conduct of the interview? Would you want it to be the same people? Again, I'm unaware as to how this happened last time, so I'd be interested in your views.
I don't think anyone from the Standards Committee was there for your interviews, were they? No. Whether we want anyone from the Standards Committee to attend.
I'd be happy to sit as a community councillor as well, layperson.
I think you should be there, Chair.
So just for clarity, because there's a difference between the panel and the interview. In fact, the last interviews conducted, who carried out those interviews?
As far as I can remember, then obviously there was Rob Tranter as monitoring officer. There was Councillor Higginson and Councillor Jordan, and there was a community councillor whose name, sorry, I can't remember. And then there was either the High Sheriff or the Lord Lieutenant of Gwent, whatever the title is, who was the independent person. That's the 5, as far as I can remember. Yeah.
And those councillors you mentioned were members of the Standards Committee at the time, as far as you were?
No, they weren't at the time. Jordan was.
Yes, Councillor Jordan was, and Councillor Higginson may have been leader or chair. Chair.
He had previously.
I think it's important to have people from this committee on that interview panel, because at the end of the day, we know what the job entails. And the panel, there's going to be a sift, is there, of who's going to do the sifting of the applications?
So the panel is what's required by statute, and then the interview would be the additional layer that I think the committee's agreed to put on it. So that the panel is what requires the one independent, one town and community council, and then no more than 5. So how we make up the constitution of the other 3 is up to this committee. It sounds like probably from the last process that was run, Rob would probably have been involved in the sift, I would imagine, and then the interview. But it sounds like the other members who conducted the interview were not part of the Standards Committee. So it's whether you want the sift to be conducted using members of the Standards Committee and then have someone appear on the interview. There's no limitation on how we conduct the interview, as far as I can see, because that's an additional process that we put in.
Chair, I think it should be somebody from the Standards Committee.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with that, David. But I think Councillor Jordan was on the Standards, so he was effectively the Standards Committee representative.
And would there be any desire for someone who's not associated with the committee once we get to interview? So, I mean, I noticed the High Sheriff or Lord Lieutenant or whatever the post was, or would it be content keeping it as members of the Standards Committee?
Is there a view on that?
Okay, well, rather than try and name names now, then I think we'll get diaries sorted for both the initial panel sift and then a subsequent interview. And actually, just on the interview, was it a single interview? It'd be interesting to learn a little bit more about what the content of that interview should be as well. But again, we can probably work that out with the details in accordance with the timings if the committee are happy with that.
I do recall Rob saying there was a very good response to the last round of interviews when the 2 Richards were appointed. So there may well be people waiting in the wings to come forward on this.
I presume that you've got all the paperwork from previous interviews and all the information that was sent out. You'd have that on file, yeah?
I have a considerable amount of information that Richard has provided me in terms of being able to put the advertisement together and understand the process. I don't have any notes that I've managed to find yet from the actual sifting criteria or how the interview questions were put together themselves, but I've probably got a little bit more delving around in the electronic archives to see what I can find.
And as far as I can remember, when I was interviewed, certainly there was all the regulations and what was expected of you, the code of conduct, and then there were about 5 cases that we were asked to consider before we came, and then we had to justify what conclusions we'd come to. It was quite a challenging interview, remember.
Thank you. I just think it'd be useful if people involved in the SIFT, if members, they could be the same people on the interview panel. Yeah.
So you have 2 applications for dispensation in front of you from community councillors from Mago Dundee Community Council. As they stand, there were some questions I had over the content of those applications in terms of the amount of information provided. So I did go back through the Mago Dundee Community Council email address from which they both came to just ask if we could get a little bit of clarification on some of the matters and also a little bit more information set down under Section 8. And I'm afraid I don't have any further information, so the committee will be required to make a decision, or however that decision might turn out, on the basis of the information provided. I'll leave it. I'll throw it open for conversation first, and then if there's any questions for me, then I think that's probably the better way to run it, rather than offer my views quite yet.
Okay, Jane.
Yeah, can I just say, looking at this, first of all, you know, the form's not been completed. Why was that not all the information disclosed? Why was that Section 8 not completed? Do we know?
It's the question I've pushed back, and I've not had a response, unfortunately.
Just come back, Chair. I just think we should throw it back at them. I just think it's a waste of this committee's time to be sent an application that hasn't been completed properly.
Yes, in all fairness to Matt on this, he did. He went back straight away to them to find out what their reasons for application were.
So absolutely, that I clocked that beforehand, thinking about our previous dispensation application, whether it was the quorum issue, you know, and the background detail and everything provided. And I'm thinking, it is a lesson actually, that actually the form needs to say that Section 8 is compulsory, and actually, like a planning application, it will not be validated without that. And on the same thought process, I was thinking, also, perhaps on the form, they should have to say, are you asking for dispensation to speak but not vote, A, or speak and vote? That would be useful. And it would also be useful, thinking about planning applications, have you had any advice or previously consulted prior to submitting from the monitoring officer? Because the big issue for me with this one was it was not clear that they've actually got prejudicial interests, either of them. And and that was a bit of and apologies for the pre-discussion with Matt before you came here, because this is a very common scenario. Loads of councillors, I'm sure in the room as well, are involved with community bodies, charities, community groups, as formal trustees or as board members, committee members. They're directors of community, companies limited by guarantee, social enterprise, etc., etc. And that all works fine. And we never get any, until here, applications for dispensation. And so it's a very common situation. Probably nearly all councillors have some sort of involvement like this. So why? Because there's no Section 8 saying, why are you asking for special treatment, given this is a common occurrence and we never get asked. So it's probably a problem with the form that could be strengthened and made clear that applications will not be accepted unless these sections are completed. A bit like online things, where you can't get to the next stage unless you've ticked a certain box.
Yeah, I would agree with that, certainly. And the online side of filling these things in, I thought we'd actually discussed this last year. and Rob is going to take it away and make it so that you could only apply online, because some of the dispensation forms that we've seen before this committee really are very difficult to read. So an online application, and particularly one where you can't go on to, as you've said, Richard, you can't go on to section number 4 unless you've completed 5 and so on, is a very good idea. The comments that Richard made about you must complete this, can we change the form to put that in there, Matt?
So I've definitely taken the action to make it an online form in the same way we've done with the recruitment that we just discussed. That's a simple process to go through as far as I can see. And I've seen examples of other forms from other authorities as well. And I think there can be an increased amount of explanation as to what the point of the form is, why the questions are being asked, seeking that information on has there been previous advice sought, what are they asking for, speaking, voting, attending, and I think that will probably help us to the point that we probably wouldn't need people to then attend to be quizzed. The form would act appropriately on itself. So yeah, in the process of taking an action to make the form electronic, I'll also revisit the content of the form and see if there is a better way. I'm fairly confident there will be a better way of putting it together if the committee is agreeable with that.
Sorry, can I just clarify? Did you say you're not expecting them to attend, or are you giving them the option to attend if they want to?
I think that option should, again, with the committee's approval, would always be a good idea, because it's easier to interrogate a person than it is a piece of paper. And I asked, in this case, if someone would be interested in attending, but like I said, I've not had a reply yet. I would hope I could get to the form to the point where no one would feel the need to attend, but I wouldn't want to remove that as an option.
I'm just reflecting on last year. It was most helpful to have the people here so that we could ask additional questions.
I'd agree with that. I don't know if everyone's aware of it or not, but the Ombudsman did produce a very handy guide to working out whether you have personal interests or prejudicial interests. It's one of those little forms that you go through and you eventually come out at an answer at the end. I always find those are really useful whenever you get an application in, just to look at it, and it leads you to hopefully the right conclusion. And on this one, I looked at it, I thought, well, there isn't a prejudicial interest there at all. Did everyone else come to that conclusion?
Yeah, I think, specifically, I think that the exemption in paragraph 12, subparagraph 2a, it says, you will not be regarded as having a prejudicial interest in any business where that business relates to, it's another public authority or body exercising functions of a public nature in which you hold a position of general control or management. And clearly it's a company limited by guarantee, it's a social enterprise, the voluntary roles, the profits can't be distributed, and its objects are all around community benefit. So I felt, therefore, that exemption would apply. And that exemption only gets thrown out further on. It says the exemptions only don't apply where the business relates to the determination of approval, consent, licence, permission or registration, typically planning or licensing applications. But because it's a community council, that's irrelevant. So I felt the exemption in 12.2a applied, and therefore, looking at it, from what we had on the paper, they couldn't have prejudicial interest from being a director of the community hub. Yeah.
So, Matt, sorry.
Yeah, on the basis of the information we have, I'm completely aligned on that point. I wonder, therefore, whether it would assist if, at the point that I do get further information, whether the committee's happy for me to make an assessment in the way I would have had advised before dispensation was put in, to say, actually, you don't require a dispensation for this, and therefore there's no requirement for this to come back in front of the committee. Okay.
Yes, I think that's a good way forward. Is there any other comments on this?
Yes, Chair. I think we've got to
David.
be very careful on this one, because going back last year, we had trouble with this community council, and Rob ended up going to court. So, and that was with 2 councillors in the same community council. So I think we need to have a finger on the button here.
I think I'm impressed with the sort of deductions you've come to there, but I don't know how you got all of that from just the information that's on that application form, or is there some more information you've been privy to about why this has been submitted? Because I think there's a bit of a fact vacuum here. I'd like to just understand why they felt they needed to put this in the first place, and just make sure we're clear on everything.
Yeah, so first of all, as we've all noted, the paragraph 8 was missing. But there's a link from the Community Council website to the Community Council Hub, which then tells you who it's accompanied by guarantee, and then it tells you who the directors are on the website. But of course, that can be checked on Companies House, so I did. So I went straight to Companies House, looked at the reg number. That's also got the objects, and it's clearly a social enterprise, or it's, I would argue, that it's a body exercising functions of a public nature under here, which that phrase occurs throughout the code. Yeah. So I felt it could, on the basis of what was on the form and what I'd discovered in the public domain that's verifiable, I felt it was definitely fell into that category. And I knew there was an exemption in the code for that from my time as a councillor. So I thought, well, I'll just go and dig out the code. And I knew also it was disapplied. So therefore I felt, actually, that line, body exercising functions of a public nature in which you hold a position of general control or management, applied to one of the applicants, who is one of the 4 directors. But I couldn't see any connection for the second because he said he was a member and there was no definition of member. So that was an open question, which I pinged back on email to Matt to say, again, we don't know what member means. He said, I'm applying because I'm a member. It's not. Director was clear. That's general control or management. That's down on the Companies House register. It's a registered company, limited by guarantee. Everything matched up. So on the basis of those facts, I felt, without any other information, and there could be some more coming, that exemption 12.2a clearly applied because it's not stopped by that test in subpara 3, and that's as far as I got, of course, but we haven't got section 8 completed.
And it is just that vacuum of facts, I think, in terms of who are these people, what are their relationships to one another and other people, and what sort of decisions are they going to be making. That's how we get ourselves comfortable, isn't it? That we're that either they don't need a dispensation, or if they do, that we can kind of make a decision. That's where we were. No, last year it was to do with there was
Quorum issue.
It was a quorum issue, wasn't it? Yeah. But we did look at a couple of case studies, I think, to do with this particular council where there was a relationship issue and there was somebody approving a role which was remunerated, and so I just prefer to know all the facts, I think, if we can.
Yeah, I did the same as Richard in terms of going on the website and just trying to develop a little bit more of understanding. Just so I'm clear on the points that I went back on. As you go through the form, 6A refers to no less than 50% being involved. So I was unclear whether we only had 2 dispensation requests out of what should have been 5 or 6 from council. So I've asked that question. I just wanted understanding that I think probably ticked more boxes than were required is the impression I got. So 6D about justification involving role or expertise, just wanted an explanation as to whether that was even necessary. 6E, it makes the reference to not then voting on financial matters, but then linking that back to 6A in terms of was it more than half of the members of the council, they were then risking having any sort of quorum. So we go back to the quorum question, which was clearly the last Standards Committee consideration. So I was just unclear on that. And then, of course, Section 8, just getting a broader understanding. So those are the questions I'm looking for answers to in order to assist, and a better understanding of Much and MECC's interaction will help answer the... it sounds like it has the potential to be, as Richard said, fairly normal jogging in terms of people's just commitment to community roles. But I just need clarification on that.
Okay. Is everyone happy with that? Okay, I think that's fair.
Well, the only one I was going to mention, I think, got covered when we went through the terms of reference, whether there was an interest for independent members to act as observers and attend town and community councils. But I think there's a report now sitting with me to write on that and a number of other things, training of chairs and a few other bits and pieces. So I'll raise that as an idea here along with all the other suggestions that were made earlier, but I don't expect any particular response because I think we covered that earlier.
Okay, thank you very much. And so if we move on to the date of the next meeting, then, which is
18th of March.
the 18th of March at 10 o'clock. Yeah? Richard?
Sorry, again, just and could we have definitely on the agenda, there's the APW, the revised sanctions guidance, but they've also just published, as they often do in a sort of stealth way, their annual report for 2017-18, which is also interesting because it summarises everything that went to tribunal over the year and their conclusions from it. It's not very long, but it's an interesting document. We could have both of those at the same time.
Just to conclude, then, thank you everyone for coming along today and braving the winter weather. I've got to say it, because everyone's got to say it at this time of year, but I hope you have a happy Christmas and a happy New Year. And we'll see you all back in March. And oh yes, we're there for the training. Is everyone going to that? Full house.
Do you need to know who's going?
It would assist, actually.